Tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu ngài Yannick Millet, chuyên gia kỹ thuật của UNDP. Dự án EECB sẽ trình bày báo cáo với chủ đề thách thức và các giải pháp phát triển tòa nhà không thải khí carbon. Xin trân trọng kính mời ngài.
Your Excellency, Dong Huang An, Mr. Rockhold, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is my great pleasure and honor to be here today, and I will conclude these sessions by trying to introduce the concept of net zero energy building. So my presentation, My presentation is broken down in four main parts. First, I will deal about the context in terms of energy and urbanization. Secondly, we'll discuss about what is a net zero energy building, because it's a bit like green building. There is a need for a definition, and so far there is no, I would say, international consensus on that, although it's getting close to a conclusion. And I will speak about challenges that we are facing right now, as well as the roadmap and the potential stakeholders' roles into developing those kind of buildings. So first of all, the general context. So as you can see, the share of the construction industry and buildings is a huge amount of the energy which is consumed, because it's more like 30% of the total energy consumption in the world. If we take the construction industry, it's even higher than that, and go up to 40%. It's the largest consolidated emitter of greenhouse gas emission in the world. And now cities are responsible for about 70% of the emissions. So basically, it's very important to address buildings if we really want to address climate change and energy shortages, energy security. In terms of demography, as you can see, the global urban population reached about 50% of the total world population by 2010, and is set to account for about 60%. So at least 2 people out of 3 will be living in cities by 2050. And we know that when we move towards cities, the energy consumption per capita is increasing. So there is a need to address that. Just as an example is the surface of Paris, which is built every 5 days, and it represents the surface of Japan on a yearly basis. And all of this, I would say, powered by most of the time electricity. So now let's see the Vietnamese context. So the construction industry is also a very important actor, because its share represents about 6% of the GDP, at least following the data 2019. Maybe this year going to be a bit special. Urbanization rate is still lower than the world average, as we can see, so there is plenty of room for future people from the countryside to move towards cities, and therefore increase the energy consumptions in buildings in those areas. As regards to growth, it's still about 9% growth of this sector, so it's a huge figure. And the total final energy consumption in buildings increased by 4% every single year. It has been mentioned earlier. 4% of increase per year means that we double the consumptions every 18 years. So every generation we have to double. So we will have to find out the solutions on how to address this, if it is possible the same way as we are doing right now. So electricity consumption in buildings, if we consolidate the residential sector and the commercial sector, is still representing 38% of the global consumption. So a huge amount. So now let's speak about metrics, because we need now to assess about what is energy consumptions in buildings. So energy consumptions in buildings is defined through one very important parameter that we call the EUI, the energy use intensity, which is somehow very straightforward, because it's all the energy which is used for space heating, for cooling, for ventilation, for lighting, for hot water, and all over the globe, that we divide by the surface. And then after we reach a kind of summary, which is expressed in kilowatt hour per square meter and per year. And of course, those EUI are specific to building typologies. You understand that a mall is consuming more energy than an apartment building, so there is a need for standardization depending on the typology. But also the climate is different. We understand that in Hanoi, we are consuming a bit less energy than in the south, because of the fact that we have winters and we don't need to cool down the building during that time. The same way, location in terms of altitude. Altitude has, of course, a very strong impact on the general consumption. So how to achieve those zero energy building? So first of all, by reducing the energy consumption. So that's the most important part of the work, i.e. the designers needs to plan the building accordingly, meaning that it's not only about high tech, it's about also making, I would say, good usage of architecture by passive strategies. First of all, to make sure that we don't have to cope with too much cooling load or too much artificial lighting. I would say to be planned. Then after, once all those considerations like orientation, passive aspects are taken into consideration, we are trying to improve the envelope, just to make sure that there is proper insulation of the building. Then secondly, only thirdly, we speak about technology and trying to integrate either efficient air conditioners or lighting or whatever kind of systems. But yeah, this not come first, this come last, definitely. And of course, in order to make it zero, then you need to produce some energy at site. So basically, this is by integrating either PV or windmills or whatever that can be done in order to produce your own electricity. And therefore, after you have to monitor that basically what you have produced is either higher or a bit smaller than what you are consuming. So that's the concept of net zero energy building. So after that, as I mentioned, there are still different terminologies used in the industry, in the sector, depending on the countries. So the most popular one now is still nearly zero energy buildings. It means that it's not exactly zero. You still need to get some power from the grid in order to sustain the building. So that's the very first step, the very basis of the pyramid. Then we have net zero energy, so basically the entire annual consumption and demand is met through the on-site renewable energy sources. You can see that here it's called net zero, but in some other countries it's zero net, you have net zero, zero net, whatever. So you see even the terminology is not yet fully harmonized all around the world. Then on top of that, now, especially in Europe, we are not only thinking about energy, but about carbon, because carbon is somehow the bottom line if we want to address all our problems. So we turn the energy into carbon. So it's a kind of different mathematics. However, it still remains the same because of the fact that you need to offset all your consumptions through renewables. It's very important. So that net zero carbon with zero carbon. And on top of the pyramid, you have positive energy. So it means that some buildings are actually producing more energy than energy consumed in their premises. So that's the top of the pyramid, and I think that's what should be aimed at, definitely, if we want to generate some positive effect all over the world. So how to achieve that? So as I mentioned, everything is to be played during the design, and it's more about brain power than about technology. It's about revolutionizing the design. It's working out new techniques, more collaborative techniques, embracing a more holistic approach into your design. Its passive aspects are primordial, as I mentioned, so we go back to the initial I would say work and main intent of architecture. It's trying to see, I would say whether it's here in Vietnam or even in Europe, in the countryside, most of the houses were facing south, just to make sure that you are covered from the northern winds and that you can get the sun during the winter time. So it's just about common sense. This is also some kind of things that can be found through feng shui considerations. So basic things. So just the brain first. So passive aspect first, through sunlight, shading, natural ventilation, and dynamic facade if can be. And then after we think about what kind of active system that can be put inside, because of the fact that first, once you have already reduced the demand, then you can afford some kind of equipment that are much more efficient for your lighting, for your cooling, and so on and so on. After, we speak about monitoring as well. It's very important to design and build a building which is efficient, but we need to make sure that it's going to perform over time. So there is a need to also plan the way to monitor the consumption inside the building and to monitor it very finely. That's through monitoring and verification system. And of course, the cherry on top of the cake is to plan the renewable energy aspect. Secondly, so who are the stakeholders involved? So to develop, construct and operate zero energy building, there is an absolute need to consider a holistic approach, as I mentioned, and to consider the full life cycle of the building. And therefore, all stakeholders should be involved almost at every stage. So it's some kind of a revolution that needs to be brought to the construction industry. I've been, I would say, preaching for that since more than 10 years, even during the time I was working for the Vietnam Green Building Council, because that's the same kind of revolution. Although green building is more holistic because it integrates the water, the waste, and all other pollution aspects. Here we are just dealing about energy, so I think it's much easier, I would say, to surround this problem and to make sure that we can find solutions. So as you can see, solutions are found first during design stage, but they are also followed during construction. And of course, if we have a building which is extremely well designed, extremely well built, but we still have people using air conditioners with open windows, then the final performance is never going to be achieved. So what is important is for everybody to understand that we are all key part of this journey. Basically because we are all building users, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, the way we use our system, whether it's for air conditioning, lighting, and so on and so on, we are the one who make the difference, because 1 + 1 + 1 makes millions, and 1 kilowatt hour multiplied by millions is millions of kilowatt hours. So upstreams, I think that the state budget and ASEAN will be very happy if this can be somehow reduced. So we all play a role all around the building life cycle, and that's this very concept that needs to be integrated. Life cycle, design, construction, but also operation, until somehow demolition. So here is a picture about what's going on in the world, because there are now a few initiatives. As you can see, Europe, the ZEBA20, has launched this kind of zero energy building program. The same in the US, through zero energy ready home. Japan as well. You can see that also the EIA is integrating net zero energy building into its strategy on how to curb greenhouse gas emission and go back to less than 2 degree rating. The World Green Building Council, which is also coordinating all actions of the US GBC, also here the Vietnam GBC, has launched the Advancing Net Zero, and now it's about 17 Green Building Councils that have defined some referentials on how to certify net zero energy building. So it's still buzzing right now, so it's verification level. Now I will illustrate my presentation with two very, I would say, iconic examples. I think the first one is the Elitis Towers is an office building built in France. It's in Dijon. It's in one cold area. And this has been, I would say, designed, built, and operated through this kind of global strategy, a holistic approach. So as mentioned, the CEO, we didn't draw the building, we wrote it down for the architects. That's all about that. You know, once you are manufacturing or designing a car, if you start by a Matisse, then along the way you will not be able to turn it into a Formula One. So if you want a Formula One, then you need to set it down from the early stage of the project. I say, I want a Formula One. And what does that mean? Then after, you define all the different parameters you want to reach in order to get this Formula One at the end of the day. So that's very important to take this into consideration. They wrote down the building. So it means that we need to write down the performance of what we expect at the end of the day, and then after, the designers will make and work together in order to achieve that. And more importantly, he says energy savings are driven by brain power rather than technology. So I am still a very strong low-tech advocate. There is no other way but low-tech anyway. High-tech just keep on piling up, and at the end of the day, we will still have more consumption. So we need to think differently, definitely. So as you can see, the office tower was built 10 years ago. It's still about 11 kilowatt hour of final primary energy per square meter and per year for an office building in a kind of cold climate in France. It's kind of very strong perspective. But the most impressive one is the first residential positive tower. Basically, it creates more energy than the people consuming inside. So basically, it covers 110% of the need of the tower. And it's zero energy bill for the tenant. They pay zero electricity bill. And everything has been built at a standard construction cost in France. So basically, I want to burst the myth of having green buildings or energy efficient buildings that cost more. Yeah, they cost more if we handle them the same way as a normal building. If we handle them differently from a holistic manner, that's what can be achieved. And that's a living proof that it can be done. And I like those buildings, definitely. They are at least icons, definitely. So now there are still challenges, because we cannot change the whole setup overnight. And so challenges about the outreach first, because there is still a very lack of awareness about the general public, about still the government, about the industry and so on. And of course, from the customers, because we are the users, the building users, but we don't know and we don't necessarily care. And there is still a lack of demonstration projects, especially here in Vietnam in this area. In terms of governance, there is a need for a very long-term vision on how to transform, I would say, this market by setting clear targets in terms of zero energy, or in terms of green building or whatever. There is also a lack of clarity of all different stakeholders' responsibilities and role that needs to be clarified. And so far, in many countries, no fiscal or financial incentives. In terms of cost, as I mentioned, there is a lot of, I would say, myth about high costs. It's high at the beginning, but if it's handled properly, it's proven that it's not that expensive. In terms of resources, there is still a lack of trained professionals and practitioners, so there is a need to build up some centers about that, because very few architects and engineers can work together to define such kind of projects. In terms of technical, there are of course some technical constraints, especially in Asia. When you are dealing with a very high tower, it's difficult to integrate PV for 100%, I would say, to cover 100% of the need, definitely. In terms of basic design, I would say we have worked on case studies with designers here through the EECB projects, and we found out that basically very often the cooling load is over dimension, sometimes by 40%. So it's an extra cost that has to be borne, and this cost could be put in having some better designers that will focus on a better envelope, and at least this is paying off, so it's a trade-off that can be found. Plug load now is exploding, so it's most of the time underestimated in design, so that's something to be addressed. Overall, there is a need for behavior change for all of us, as I mentioned. I will still stress out this point. We are the main consumer, we are the one switching on and off the buttons, so we have to be fully responsible for that and to understand what does that mean. And in terms of general implementation, there is some differences, of course, depending on the region, whether it's hot climate, it's cold climate, whether it's new buildings or existing buildings. So now, what's the way to go? So it's a kind of a combined approach, definitely, collaboration, first led by the governments, because there is the need to establish a roadmap and to form a common vision for the whole country. Then there is a need to mandate some codes. So now, right now we have the PCVN 09, which is mandating some attributes of the buildings, but we should shift likely in the coming years towards performance-based code, i.e. you guys have to design and build a 50 kilowatt-hour per square meter building for something like that. That's the way it works in Europe and in many other countries. We should also work on the education aspect, so there is a need to form architects, engineers, and also to get more data out of the building performance benchmarks. That's what we are doing through the EECB projects. We are going to work out energy consumption benchmarks for 6 typologies, for office, malls, hotels too, and public buildings. So that's the first step, just to know where we are right now. And communication, so there is a need also to raise awareness, generally speaking, and build capacity of the general public. And of course, it should be generated through innovation, so creating new business model, new way of designing building and building as well, constructing building. And circular pattern, if possible, indeed. Well, so here are the government's role. So you see, there are plenty, definitely, because the government is here to play a very important role, a very central role. It's said to be the main driver to defining a clear roadmap, objective, respective roles of all stakeholders, leading by example. I think also by building its own building to be net zero or green building, it sends a very strong signal to the industry. I think that's one way to go. Of course, after playing the stick and the carrot, so the stick is by regulating a bit more strongly, I would say, the construction and the design. through performance-based, hopefully in the coming years. But on the other hand, also is to provide some incentive, whether it's fiscal or financial incentive, in order to push developers to go in this direction. And of course, it plays an important role by raising the awareness of the general public, by leading the development of the related expertise for the construction industry. Other actors, as I mentioned, utilities, so EDN also has a very important role. It should monitor on those kind of buildings and also provide also some potential incentive or reward those net zero energy buildings. Developers should understand that they are here to build from the long-term perspective, so they should consider this life cycle assessment of their building, just to make sure that everything is integrated and make sure that EE considerations are integrated from the design. Buildings should be monitored from design until operation to achieve their final goal, as I mentioned. So basically, it's also very important to monitor and to see what we are consuming and to at least assess that. In terms of financial, of course, banks should be able to provide loans in order to facilitate this uptake for this industry. So they can, and they should consider also their investment on a more holistic way, definitely. As regards the academia is playing a very important role because they are here also to train the architects and the engineers, whether they are the young ones, undergraduated, or also potentially to provide some training for practitioners. They are also here to provide some expertise to the government, so they can experiment a lot of things or techniques throughout their universities. They are also here to educate the students how to change their curriculum. And finally, the civil society, so you and I, we are all here to play our role. Non-profit organizations are here most of the time to play a role of third-party certifying bodies, like it is for the green building, but also it could be done also for net zero energy. They are also here to reach more and more people, so to raise the general awareness. Citizens, we need to develop this kind of energy efficiency culture because of the fact that I am very much unsure that we will all be able to benefit from the same level of energy supplies that we have now in the next 10 or 20 years, whether it's here, even in my country, I think so, because as was mentioned earlier, 57% increase of the consumption by 2050. I don't know how we are going to make it. So we have to think it by now. If not, we're going to have some very hard work on it, I would say, basically. And also, it's for building owners and tenants to work together and to make, I would say, more information on how to use the systems, just trying to avoid waste overall. So now, my last slide is what can be done right now in Vietnam in order to accelerate the take-up. So I choose just a few points out of what I just mentioned. So the government is to lead by example, definitely. So it's to form inter-ministerial committees and to coordinate complementary action. So we work in close collaboration, of course, with the Ministry of Construction, but the Ministry of Construction has the responsibility of the building for its design construction. But as soon as it goes into operation, it's more like MIT, or there is a kind of gray area here. So there is a need to make sure that we consider the whole building, the life cycle, and make sure that all potential ministries involved, whether it's MOC, whether it's MIT, whether it's MPI, whether it's MOF or non-RED, can work together into a kind of committee that will depend directly on the Vice Prime Minister office, because it's a kind of transversal role that is to be led by the government. And making just one ministry in charge is likely not the way to go. There is, of course, a need to establish some excellence center, just to make sure that architects and engineers can train themselves. There is a need to strengthen codes and to mandate them, basically potentially to go for energy performance-based code in the coming years after it will be revised. There is a need to define a monitoring and verification system so that it makes everybody agree on this system. Now the ESCO work is not yet very much developed because of the fact that nobody very much agrees on how to monitor and verify the energy savings. So there is a need for the government to make a clear cut on what is the system to be used in Vietnam, so that we can record and we can all speak the same language, whether it's the owner, whether it's the energy service provider, or whether it's the bank which is going to provide the loan. So it's very important. On top of that, there is need also for a definition of energy efficiency labeling and certification system. So that's also what we are working on the EECB projects, and I will encourage you to follow up the activities of the projects, because we will soon organize a conference and workshop to launch these first energy benchmarks done for three typologies, as I mentioned, and also the e-labeling system that should be implemented in Vietnam for existing buildings. So that's very important. At least it will play a very important role in knowing where we are, and also to somehow raise the awareness of the public about that. Defining incentive scheme, whether it's fiscal or whether it's financial, is also very important, because we cannot only hit the people on the head, we also need to give some carrots just to make sure that it's properly balanced in terms of policy. And at the end of the day is, of course, to develop some examples. So basically the government should choose one or two buildings first, and to make them net zero energy and advertise for that. Well, that's a very long journey, but basically if we want to have smart and efficient city, we have no choice but to have efficient buildings, that's for sure. Thank you very much for your attention.